someday to get this good.
On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the story of a Chinese-owned factory in heartland America. And the new development bank doubles down on development projects. We speak to their CFO to see how the NBB stands out from the established banks. And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin today's show with an American documentary film which has incited debate both inside and outside the U.S. American Factory, it is called, the first film from former U.S. first couple Barack Obama and Michelle Obama's Higher Ground Productions, premiered last week on Netflix. It tells the story of Chinese company Fuyao's factory in the U.S. state of Ohio. Before we ask our panelists, what exactly is this movie trying to tell us, and how do they see the stories within it? Take a look at this introduction of the movie first.
American Factory steams ahead in the U.S. heartland. A multi-year collaboration between Obama's Higher Ground and Netflix, telling a story of what happened when a Chinese company took over an abandoned General Motors plant. Directed by Academy Award-nominated filmmakers Stephen Bognar and Julia Reichart, the documentary examines the lives of blue-collar workers in Dayton, Ohio, who were laid off from their auto jobs in the 2008 recession. Some of whom were hired 6 years later by Fuyao, a Chinese manufacturer of automotive glass. 2,000 Buckeyes are hired to work shoulder to shoulder with experienced Chinese employees. Early days of hope and optimism give way to setbacks as executive China clashes with working-class America. Both the factory and employees are adapting. In the film, a Fuyao executive said, "We are melding two different cultures, the Chinese and the American." Former U.S. President Barack Obama tweeted, "A good story gives you the chance to better understand someone else's life. It can help you find common ground, and it's why Michelle and I were drawn to Higher Ground's first film." This film started shooting in 2015, when the then U.S. administration encouraged Chinese companies to enter the American market. However, things have changed a lot in the past few years. Now American Factory has debuted amid the year-long China-U.S. trade war.
So what does the film American Factory, the documentary film, reveal about the investment between China and the United States, and also the interactions and differences as well as similarities between the two peoples? Let's loop in our panelists. For now, we are joined by Arthur Dong, professor of Georgetown University's McDonald School of Business. Professor, help us to understand, you have watched the movie, I would assume.
Yes, I have.
What do you make of it?
Yes, the film, I think, is a beautifully made film in terms of a wonderful piece of documentary filmmaking that sort of captures it's a story of both death and resurrection. On the one hand, we see a dying automotive plant that has been abandoned by General Motors, a source of employment and livelihood for this town for many generations. And then as a result of this, a Chinese company in a very unlikely situation coming to this town in Dayton, Ohio, making hundreds of millions of dollars of investment to revive the fortunes of this factory and to create employment for American workers.
Professor Dong, one of the things very important to bear in mind is the timing of the movie. When it was begin shooting, it was actually the time when the Obama administration was encouraging Chinese investment into America to create jobs and opportunities. Now we are at a very different stage. If you look at the recent history, the trade war going on between China and the United States, and certainly Chinese investment were being kicked out of the U.S. as a result of various changes of policies and attitudes. So when you look at that movie now, in retrospect, what do you make of the dramatic change taking place just over the past 5 years or so?
Yes, I think the movie itself is a stunning piece of of information with regard to the current narrative that the Trump administration is portraying, that trade with China is a one-way street. As we could see clearly, as demonstrated in this film, that when Chinese companies make investments in the United States, those investments do lead to economic value and also wind up benefiting Americans and American society in many significant ways. And so I think one of the things that has been discussed is whether or not Chinese companies would be able to engage more actively in the U.S. economy. And of course, many Chinese companies have, over the past dozen years or so, have expressed strong interest in terms of, finding ways to invest in America. But as a result of policy, oftentimes they are met with a cold shoulder.
Yes, indeed. And now we are also joined by Madeline Janis, who is the Executive Director of the Strategic Policy Center Jobs to Move America. Ms. Janis, welcome to our program. I understand you're joining us through the phone. Tell me about your understanding of this film. I understand you've also been writing some of the commentaries in some of the publications in the U.S. You've been talking about the jobs and creation as well as taking away of jobs as a result of the changes. What do you make of the story?
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here. It's a beautifully told story, and it really is a quintessentially American story. In other words, in my view, the way that Fuyao treats its workers and really acts toward the city of Dayton and toward American workers is very, very similar in not a good way to the way that European companies act, the way that American companies act, which is to really start to see these workers as less than human, as not deserving of the rights to be represented by union, the rights to have a safe working conditions, to make a living wage. And so you see the story unfold, and you see really an American story. And I think the title is apt, American Factory. And what I've been writing about is that Chinese owners are just as varied and different as American owners are. And so the Fuyao company treats its workers badly and really works hard to target and fire people who are standing up for their rights. But we've dealt with other Chinese companies who have treated their workers well in the United States. And so, and we've dealt with American companies who treat their workers badly. So for me and for us, this is really an incredible insight into what happens in the United States when workers try to stand up for themselves and really to be treated as human beings.
Very interesting, your observation, Ms. Janis. I mean, one of the things people have been talking about is the different ways of governance in the enterprises, and also how workers are being rallied to work and what their work ethics compared to so-called the labor rights protection as well as the cultural differences. What do you make of this mixture of various factors, being reflected in one factory over there when the U.S. is trying to call upon international investors to come into the United States and try to create jobs for the American workers?
In some ways, I think that's kind of a false comparison. Honestly, I think that, yes, it looks in the film as though the Chinese work ethic is work harder and the American work ethic is work less and even be lazy. But in truth, some of the Chinese workers also struggle with overwork and not being able to spend time with their families. And I think that the same situation plays out in American factories or Canadian-owned factories, where workers are forced to work mandatory overtime. They don't have time with their families. They have to work so hard they get sick. And for us, that is really the essence. Wherever people work, they should have a decent life.
Right.
People should work hard. We want people to work hard, but also people are people.
This is exactly some of the debates going on inside that factory, beautifully captured by the storytellers and the producers. That is, they even eventually have a vote among all the factory workers as to whether they want a union factory or they do not want a union factory. And the latter won with most of the majority of the votes. It's a very interesting situation over there. On the one hand, that people want to have less work pressure and less, shall I say, workload. But on the other hand, they do not want to have a life in which they do not have a job to support their family. So it really gives us interesting comparison, Professor Dong. When you look at that very complex situation. This is really the globalization 2.0 that we're talking about, the dilemma of globalization and the dilemma of supply chains, the dilemma of factories and workers, as well as their local communities that have to face the latest development, Professor.
Yes, Tian. Companies like Fuyao Glass, as well as General Motors, are not immune from the competitive forces of a global economy. Just as General Motors had an operation there for generations, they found that they could no longer support that factory, and because that factory became uncompetitive. And so Fuyao faces the same sort of very, very unrelenting amount of pressure, as well as a very unforgiving economic environment. For Fuyao to survive and to justify their hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, they have to make that factory succeed. In other words, Fuyao's customers, such as General Motors, Honda, and Toyota, they all demand high-quality glass at a stipulated price. And if Fuyao cannot meet those price conditions, they're going to be out of business. I think what was portrayed in the movies, in this movie itself, was the fact when the union vote came up and 2/3 of the workers in the factory decided to reject the union, there's nobody that understands their local economic circumstance better than those workers. They understand very clearly, what's my next best alternative? Where am I going to go should I lose this job? And realizing that, and yes, that the wages that they were conditioned to receive from the former plant at General Motors was not going to be the same level of wages they would receive under Fuyao Glass. They made a very, very sort of reasoned sort of judgment in terms of what is my next best alternative. This is still the best thing going in town, and so therefore I've got to keep my job. And so it's the economic realities that the workers face, as well as the company faces, that all the participants in this movie are very well, attuned to.
Professor Dong, if I could continue, there's another interesting phenomenon reflected in the movie, which I think is quite representative about any foreign investors into a different country. American companies to China, Chinese companies to the United States too. For example, localization of the management. Now, the movie was portraying at the very beginning, an American was hired to be the manager of this Fuyao America. But eventually things didn't work out and he was somewhat fired. And an ethnic Chinese, a Chinese American, was being chosen in this case to be the CEO of Fuyao America. How do you see that? Of course, this is only one story. It's not representative of all the companies. But how do you see the challenges of localization, particularly in a very different culture, business, and also lifestyle as well?
Yeah, I would agree, Tian, that this is a movie that so beautifully portrays the sort of cultural conflicts and clashes, in a sense, a clash of civilizations, when Chinese companies try to operate in the United States. And certainly American companies operating in China have experienced the same thing. For many reasons, I suppose, behind the scenes, it's not fully explained to us as to why the American manager is the first to be appointed as a general manager of the factory. And then we later see him displaced, by a Chinese American who's bought in. Now, oftentimes there might be sort of issues of cultural similarity that are at play here, wherein Mr. Cao, who's the CEO, might feel more comfortable in dealing with somebody who is more akin or closer to his own culture. But what we see also is this. I think what we see is a very stark portrait and sort of differences between Chinese culture and American culture. Chinese culture being collectivist, and you could see that expressed when the American managers were flown to China to examine the Chinese factory, and American culture being much more individualistic. And so I think that's one of the sort of overall messages that this film portrays.
Ms. Janice, if you're still there with us.
Yes.
Wonderful.
I just wanted to, okay, go ahead, because
Yes.
I had a strong disagreement with the professor.
Go ahead.
Well, anybody who watches the movie would see that the workers who were supporting a union, which is a collectivist endeavor, were targeted, were fired, were threatened. And of course people voted no because they were scared to death. They were so scared to stand up for themselves. You know, I think this was an example of how workers in this country, in the United States, and in many parts of the world, are treated when they want to stand up and have just a decent job. We're not talking, you know, making $90,000 a year.
I see.
And I've seen Chinese companies who respect workers' rights to be in a union and who work quite well with workers and pay them a decent wage and still are competitive.
Well, we could tell, Ms. Janice, you're coming from the perspective of the union. Of course, whether workers' rights is best protected by a union factory or a factory that could at least operating and offer jobs to the people is, as I said, a beautiful debate going on in that film. Certainly, there's a lot being reflected. Having said that, though, Ms. Janice, I want to ask you about some of the quotes coming from Mr. and Mrs. Obama, the first couple, of course, former first couple, when they were in a way supporting this film to promote it around the world. Some of them were suggesting that some of the stories remind them of their childhood. They are, you know, they were being raised in some parts of America in which the family life was very much like that, and the fathers and the mothers are workers. So how do you see that the endorsement of the former first couple, in a way, for this movie to be spread around the world, and what kind of message is this sending, Ms. Janice?
Sure. I want to say that I am not coming from a union perspective or a non-union perspective. I'm coming from a human perspective.
Thank you. Well, what about this question I asked you? I hope we are not going to answer the same question over and over again, if you can.
I will. I'm happy to talk about the you know, president and former first lady, that they come from working class families, and especially Michelle Obama comes from a working class family in Chicago, where, you know, people have to go to work every day and try to, you know, support their families on, you know, modest income, and also raise their kids in a way that gives them, you know, hope for the future. And I think you see that throughout this film, that there are working class families, both Chinese and American, who are really trying to just live a good life and also treat, you know, raise their children in a way that breeds hope. And I think that's really appealing. This makes this film very appealing as just a wonderful story about people trying to make a better life for themselves and their families.
Right. Especially in the United States, Ms. Janice, if you think about the Rust Belt where Ohio is located, the dramatic change as a result of the industrialization and the upgrading of the industrialization for this part of your country. So what do you think? What kind of impact is it really having from your perspective? All the industrial changes and also digitalization, as well as the state of the U.S. economy for the local workers?
Well, I think that factory workers, for example, have been facing technological change for many, many years. And I think technology is a fact of life. And so how we adapt to technology and how workers adapt to technology depends on many things, including the willingness of employers to retrain people and to continue to create good jobs. And I think we're seeing, in many places, we're seeing a growth of industrial jobs. They're just changing in many ways the nature of those jobs. The big question for people like me and most Americans is, are these going to be good jobs? Are these jobs going to have create a future for those families and for the communities?
Right.
And I think we don't know the answer to that question, but hopefully it's yes.
It's certainly still a question mark. Professor Dong, go to you. Some of the scenes in the movie being portraying the American workers and the management went to the headquarters of the Chinese company Fuyao and were with them during the New Year gala in a way. A lot of Chinese-style performances and even the wedding ceremony for many of those employees were being held in that gala. So the American management team, as well as the representative of the American workers, were quite impressed, and some even shed tears about how humans are really connected. Professor Dong, as a Chinese American, when you are watching that scene, I'm sure there's another layer of complexity of feelings over there.
Yes, that was a fascinating scene in which I think when they invited the American managers and workers to China, to the Fuyao factory, I think for some of these Americans it was the first time they ever set foot in China. And so it was sort of revelatory in terms of what they found was both inspiring as well as, they were able to sort of, in a sense, see the cultural differences starkly between China and America. What they saw was a company celebration at the Chinese New Year, wherein the company, again, engaged in a banquet for all of their employees. And then their employees and their families staged, entertainment for the entire assembled crowd, as well as, marriage ceremony performed on stage. But what the American managers came away with was that they were, in a sense, very, very much inspired by what they saw, and they were inspired by the sheer amount of efficiency of how well the factory itself was being run, and so as well as sort of the collective culture of Fuyao, wherein the employees sang company songs, dedicated themselves with slogans towards the success of the company, and this is something you would almost never see in an American factory.
Right. Of course, some of the American management are trying to take that back to America and try to implement that style, and it didn't work eventually. But it really just shows how complicated it is when we are on the learning curve to see the new change as a result of the globalization and industrialization. Having said that, though, Professor Dong, I want to follow up. We were trying very hard over the past few days, try to reach both the producers, directors, as well as assistant producers of this film. And we failed to have any one of them agree to come to this program or to be on our network. However, we all understand that this movie, this factory itself, has granted the crew almost no, in a way, almost every access to what's going on within the company, whether it's in a meeting room or it is a private conversation between two employees, or the management of the Chinese Fuyao, how they reflect upon their experiences in America. So I'm not trying to make any conclusion. I'm just saying it seems that things are getting ever more complicated, and it's getting ever more politically sensitive in a way. How do you see that, Professor Dong, even reflected in the movie itself?
Well, the film itself and the access that the Fuyao had granted to the filmmakers, to me, was nothing short of remarkable. They gave them a tremendous amount of access, and in a very sort of uncontrolled manner, allowed even the conversations of their Chinese managers to be recorded. And some of those conversations were not exactly, I would say, complimentary, in terms of how they had spoken about some of the activities that they had been observing on the American factory floor. I mean, it's funny because Fu Yao's glasses, we are transparent, and of course that carried through in this movie, and I was just stunned because it's very rare for a Chinese company, or an American company for that matter, to give a filmmaker that kind of unfettered access to the factory floor, and thus, in my opinion, resulting in a much better and finer piece of filmmaking.
And Ms. Janice, if you're still there, I also want to follow up with you about an important question. That is, you know, with how much of an open mind that we need to be today, when there are a lot of changes going on, and there are a lot of things that we are not familiar with or we are not used to, and that could become a fact of life. From your perspective, whether it's workers or factories, companies, or people to people, even country to country, how do you understand that?
Well, I think, you know, open mind goes multiple ways. You know, on one hand, one of the reasons I wrote an opinion piece in the Los Angeles Times is because there are now many assumptions about Chinese people being, you know, not caring about workers, not caring about communities, not being willing to be a partner in communities, and I have seen that to not be true. On the other hand, there are Chinese stereotypes about Americans that are shown in the film, and I think when you talked about American workers not supporting their companies, I think that's a stereotype. I think that most American workers strongly support their companies. They also want their companies to treat them fairly, and so I think that, you know, those are not contradictory. So I think we all have a lot to learn from this film about how we see each other and how we see our common humanity, and how stereotypes are really the opposite of what we need to be doing. We need to be open-minded, as you said, and we need to be willing to think about what it takes for people to have good lives and for communities to have success.
Thank you so much, Madeline Janice and Arthur Dong, helping us to understand your perspective about this fascinating film, documentary film called American Factory. It is not just a film, it's actually with this film and through this film what we can learn about each other. Thank you so much, really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Development Bank doubles down on development projects. We asked the CFO of the new Development Bank to see how the NDB stands out from the established banks. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. As the prospects of the China-U.S. trade deal seems to change by the second, major U.S. stocks have swung back and forth in the past week. Tumbling on Friday, then regaining ground on Monday, the only certainty seems to be uncertainty. A new round of tit-for-tat tariffs are set to take effect on September the 1st. On Friday, Fed Chair Powell declined to cut interest rates, dashing any hopes of jump-starting the American economy. Meanwhile, development banks continue to fund projects in developing nations across the world. The new Development Bank was founded 4 years ago by the BRICS countries. It has approved more than $9 billion in loans and aims to double that number this year. The new Development Bank is considered a newcomer compared to the World Bank, the IMF, and the Asian Development Bank. Despite a shorter resume, the new Development Bank is using new models to stand out from the crowd. Can emerging multilateral organizations such as the new Development Bank turn the tide in the face of turmoil? Earlier, I talked to Leslie Masdorp, Vice President and CFO of the new Development Bank. I started our conversation by congratulating him on the NBD's getting its first AAA bond issuer rating from Japan Credit Rating Agency. Let's listen in.
All of the other AAA institutions in the world today, the Asian Development Bank, World Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, all of these institutions have either the United States or Japan or leading European economies, but essentially AAA economies as shareholders, as parents, if you like. the new development bank have exclusively emerging markets. We have China, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa as shareholders. These are all developing countries. None of these countries have a AAA shareholding. So in many respects, the AAA achievement underpins what the bank has built. Our shareholders have enabled this growth, obviously, in guiding us and building firm foundations for the institution.
And how are you looking at the issue of keeping a balance? On the one hand, you want to make sure you're hands-on in a way that there will be as little risk as possible, but on the other hand, you still have a strong and impressive portfolio to begin with.
Yeah, I think the starting point I should highlight is that the bank over these 4 years have built up a loan book, a portfolio size of $10.4 billion of approved loans. And we have done that essentially, if you like, by making sure that our risk management policies are in line with all of our highly rated peers, like the World Bank, Asia Development Bank, and so on. But I think the important element here is that the bank has had a rapid growth, but not in any way compromising on what is called conservative risk management standards and policies. We do not cut corners, if you like. We make sure that every project is financially sustainable. We study the balance sheets of the companies that we lend to. We do detailed risk management analysis of our projects before we approve these loans. So it is a balancing act.
When you say new, when you say innovative, what exactly are you referring to? Obviously, when you are looking at those factors, the other development banks around the world, whether regional or international, are also looking at those possibilities.
We are a small institution. We are more nimble, more agile. We can be more responsive to our borrowers. So we do not have thousands of people, with lengthy procedures and bureaucracy. Now, one concrete way, Tianwei, in way this is given expression is in the form of faster decision-making processes. For example, when we approve a loan, doesn't matter if the loan is $300, $400, $500, $600 million, we will approve that within a period of less than 6 months, sometimes as little as 3 months. In some comparable institutions, it can take up to a year, even 15 months for that loan to be approved. So the first aspect of what we are trying to do differently is about the speed and agility. Right? That's the first one. The second aspect is that we have no legacy, which means that there's no, for example, commitment to dirty industries. We do not have a dirty coal portfolio that we are saddled with now that is doing massive damage to the environment. All of our energy assets are green. So another thing that we're trying to do differently is that we want to build a substantive infrastructure portfolio that is almost wholly committed to the green economy. We want to clean up the air. Our pollution levels in big cities in India, in China, and other countries, we have to clean up this environmental footprint from the accelerated growth that China has had and the damage that has been done in the last couple of decades. We are committed to undo that. Other banks are doing it as well, as you correctly pointed out, but in our case, we do not have that legacy portfolio where we are still contributing to the expanded pollution levels.
Of course, you offered a green bond in the China market, and now you're also working on a bond market and possibility in South Africa. So how diversified it will be as a result of the new approaches, Leslie, and also the latest development of the geopolitics in the world when it comes to buy the portfolio of the new development bank?
That is one other area in which we are trying to differentiate ourselves, and that is our commitment to what we call local currency financing. Now, most of the lending and most of the financial transactions in the world today is in US dollar. US dollar, as you know, is the anchor global reserve currency. All cross-border trade and investment flows are pretty much conducted in US dollar. It does not make sense to conduct all of our lending activities in US dollars for two reasons. Firstly, our markets, whether it's China or Brazil, South Africa, all of our BRICS countries have very strong and deep capital markets. What that means is that we can raise funding by issuing bonds in all of our 5 countries and then on-lend in that local currency. That is a more efficient way to lend, so we want to have a more balanced portfolio. For example, the renminbi is today a much more significant currency in terms of trade finance, and as the renminbi internationalizes, will become even more important now that it is part of the special drawing rights of the IMF. We've already issued a green bond in China, and in total now we've issued 6 billion renminbi of bonds here in China, and we still have another 7 billion renminbi of bonds that we will still issue within the next 15 months to finance infrastructure projects here in China.
You heard about, whether through news or other channels, the dispute going on between the Fed and the White House about the future of the interest rates and the future of the dollar. You also see that's reflected in the international market, the turbulence over the past few weeks. So as a new development bank, how do you see all of these latest stories coupled up with the so-called trade war going on between China and the United States and the U.S. and several other strong economies in the world?
I would just make a few observations. The first one is that it's clear that we are living in a period of significant distress in what has been the rule-based global order as it has existed over the last 75 years. There's no question that right now we are going through turbulence, and this turbulence will result in something new. We're not sure yet what that something new will be, but it will be different, right? The one thing, though, is certain, is that we have to try and protect the essential multilateral model. If you look at the world post-1944, as you know, we had a Second World War, and countries were much more inward-looking, much more nationalistic, much more protectionist, and only tried to look after themselves in the aftermath of the war. We then had a new system that evolved, and this new, what I would call a global rules-based system that had existed for the last 70, 75 years, is now coming under strain for several reasons, but one of them is that emerging markets have been left out or do not have as much voice and representation as they ought to have. In other words, the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of Brazil, and all of these large emerging markets, the global developments have not kept pace and given these economies more voice globally. So whatever happens, one, we have to protect the multilateral order, look at how to reform it, but preserve the essence of the world working together in a cooperative way to find solutions. Tianwei, the important thing here is, as you know, there are many of the biggest intractable problems that the world faces today. You cannot resolve just in one country. No. China cannot resolve climate change, for example. It's a global problem. China cannot solve problems of refugees, or lack of biodiversity, or the fact that our oceans are full of plastic. We can only do and resolve these very big global challenges by working together. So multilateral content of the global system has to be preserved. And two, we cannot have a system of powerful countries bullying smaller countries. We have to look at our common destinies, the interconnectedness of the public good. In order for countries to flourish today, they need to work with their neighbors. When they build roads, the roads don't stop at their borders. The roads continue, the power lines continue across the border. So infrastructure and continuing to invest in infrastructure is an important element of this future. What
do you make of all the near future issues? For example, IMF is looking for the new managing director, and the U.S. is at this moment still looking at more bilateral rather than multilateral, including with the international development banks and institutions, and also the geopolitics that is going on. I know it's a big question once again, but to New Development Bank, how would you comb through these and try to come up with your best option so far?
I think it's very important for whatever solutions we seek today to have a much more inclusive approach, as I said earlier on, which embrace the new rising emerging market powers. There cannot be major decisions made about who occupies the leadership of institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and global institutions without taking into account the important new economic actors, right? And we need to have, like the G20, which is focused on consensus. The G20, they don't make decisions there based on voting. So it's a consensus-style approach where you seek as maximum form of consensus. If you have disagreement, you try and iron it out. But the idea of simply one or two powerful countries using their power and hegemony, that has to belong to the past.
I see. Leslie Masdorp, Chief Financial Officer and Vice President of the New Development Bank. Thank you once again, sir, for joining us, and congratulations to the AAA rating given to the New Development Bank recently. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.